Recording. Dad, it's Friday night.
I know it's Friday night, evidence-based triathlon coming to you from beautiful Las Vegas. I think we hit another high, another record temperature this week.
I love this time of year. It's
me too.
Cool in the morning, warm in the day, cool in the evening.
I just totally dig it right now. Like the running in the morning is just so enjoyable. Sun's coming up, you're not sweating. Yeah. It's been really it's been a nice couple of weeks here for sure. So yeah,
I actually took an extra day off today and I did not train.
I did not train today either. So
nice.
That's good. A lot of Fridays I don't train because I go pretty big on the weekends.
Yeah.
And I like to go into the weekend fresh, or somewhat fresh, so I can accomplish the lofty goals. So I know there's a lot of people that take Monday off or something in the midweek, but for me, Friday seems to work out really, really well. And with work, usually Friday's a little bit less hectic, and so I can just maybe just relax a little bit more mentally as well, and get ready for the weekend. And so yeah, that's how I kind of build my life normally.
I like that. Now I do maybe somewhat similar. I do Friday. I always do when prepping for an Ironman. I'll use Friday for my long swim day.
Okay.
And I'll do anywhere between 4,000 and 5,000 yard swim, and then I'll do a long run on Saturday and a long run or long bike on Sunday. So that Friday is still sort of getting fresh to hit.
Well, you say your legs are getting fresh, right?
What's that?
You're freshening your legs.
That's right. So, and I like leading in with the long swim because of that. It does give some, it doesn't wear you down for the weekend.
That's for sure. Especially if you're just doing like that long, like where you're doing like a 4K swim. Yeah, for sure. My problem is usually I practice on Thursday night of swimming and my arms are usually pretty sore still, but yeah. So let's talk this week about training zones. And I think that we need to, because there's a lot of confusion out there, a seven zone model, a 3 zone model, a 5 zone model. When should I be doing what should I be doing? And ultimately, what are these zones based off of? So John, when you train, do you use zones?
Well, I think we're going to be on the opposite side of this discussion a little bit.
I don't think we are as much as you think, because I don't use them very much either anymore.
My approach, as an older athlete now, is really, my focus is on consistency.
Yep.
I really want to sustain a good, consistent exercise routine throughout a week, throughout 2 weeks, throughout 3 weeks, 4, 5, whatever. And so I really focus in on keeping the intensity at a region that I can wake up the next day and do it again. And so a lot of times my zone, if I'm in a zone, is on a very low range. So I do a lot of easy to moderate workouts.
So you are using zones?
Not
you're just using ones?
I don't check my heart rate while I'm running. Well, I do. I'll look at it, but I'm not trying to reach a particular zone other than I want to stay the majority of my training in a really low sustained zone.
Yep. And I mean, then the question becomes, and this is, what more and more athletes are asking and have asked me is, okay, you do a lot of zone 1, zone 2 work, which we'll talk about those zones are. You do a lot of aerobic, let's call it aerobic work. How do you ever get faster if you only do that?
Oh, that's a good question. That's what people worry about, and that's why they tend to try to include more high intensity training. And there's a lot of good research on high intensity training, but for me, again, as an older athlete, it's really being able to sustain exercise over a long period of time.
Yeah.
Now, okay, so anecdotally, what I do is also I do incorporate some higher intensity at a race. So I sign up.
Not this year.
No, not this year. So I signed up for a sprint race, and I love sprint races because those are high intensity situations. And, leading up to a sprint race, I will incorporate some speed work as described, but remember what it's like to try to run, fast as opposed to slow. But I do think that learning to run fast, it's a skill, not necessarily a physiological issue. You have to learn how to run.
Yeah. And I think, honestly, John, I think that you really hit a really important point here, is that and we've talked about this before, most of the research in this area on zones and training volume and pushing different zones is done with young athletes, right? As you and I are getting up there in age, I think we do need to really think about what we're doing, right? And the way I look at it, I am one really hard training session away from being hurt. And I think any older athlete is, right? Mm-hmm. There's just not that amount of much wiggle room on the high intensity stuff. And so I'm really, really careful, especially running, to not overdo my high intensity. And mm-hmm. So I have not done much high intensity this year because there hasn't been racing. Because normally I do high intensity coming into a race, like mm-hmm. just kind of, turning that over, that neuromuscular patterning. And so I really haven't. So the last few weeks, I decided, I haven't had a race in a long time. Mm-hmm. I haven't had to, as far as running, in a long time. So I actually started to dabble back into doing some VO2 max work and some lactate threshold work, but just short. I started out first week, I did 550 meter sprints. Mm-hmm. And 550, about 200 meter hill sprints. And that was it. So mm-hmm. It's not a lot of total volume, but the idea is just the neuromuscular, mm-hmm. Patterning. And then, I did that one day of the week. And then this week I did the same thing. I just added, I did 6 and 6. So just a small add. And then my goal is, for the new year, is to run a 5K or a 10K really fast. Mm-hmm. Because I haven't, so normally I'd be doing a 5K this weekend, and then for sure for turkey, for Thanksgiving, I'd run a 5K that morning, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not getting that stimulus right now because I'm like you, I like to race myself, into those zones. So that being said, let's I think what we need to do is kind of demystify some of the training zones. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen, and I know we're going to be doing this as a podcast, so we'll do our very best to talk people through these. But I think it's important that we kind of demystify the zones and talk about what the crucial parts of the zone training method is, and I guess why we actually have zones. Yeah. So I think that the first thing to understand with the zones is and in general, these are the easiest way to look at a zone. And what we're looking at here is what truly happens under the hood and what happens physiologically at each point. And this is this is RPE. So what's RPE stands for? Perceived exertion, rate of perceived exertion, right? We can see RPE sometimes on a scale of 20, sometimes on a scale of 10. This is a scale of 5. But this is kind of the very basic looking at what zones are. And if you look in most of the literature, there'll be some kind of verbiage that's like this. And what we'll do is we're going to move through some different zones today. And we're going to go from a zone 1, which in general is very easy, moving up to zone 2, which is getting up to the top of where our aerobic more purely aerobic training is, then into tempo. And it's interesting. Tempo is a really interesting one. So tempo depends on who you are. If you look at the running community, tempo has a different meaning than a triathlon and a bike. So in the running community, tempo is usually race pace or just slightly below race pace. In the triathlon world, tempo basically is everything above zone 2 or above the aerobic zone. Then we move to the lactate threshold, which is in this model is zone 4, and then VO2 max. And we'll break these down a little bit more. This is the kind of the easiest way to look at it. And I'm going to just move on to the next slide here.
Let me add to that just a bit.
Yeah, please.
The RPE, you mentioned that's rating of perceived exertion.
Yeah.
And you stated that there are 2 scales, 1 to 10 and 6 to 20. Yeah. And just a little bit of history on that. This is a scale that we use in the exercise industry to be able to talk to each other in terms of how hard exercise is. It originated with Gunnar Borg back in '82. Yep. And he came up with a 6 to 20 point scale. And this is how he did it. He had a bunch of people exercise to maximum effort. And along the way, he asked them how hard exercise was, and using different descriptors like fairly light, somewhat hard, very hard, and maximal, that he ultimately was able to see there was a link between the perception of intensity and the actual intensity, because he measured heart rate and VO2, with VO2 really being the true measure of intensity. Yep. And then he looked at the heart rates and he said, oh, wow, this is actually pretty cool. If I take a person's heart rate and divide it by 10, I'll actually get something that's really related to their perception. So you want to take a guess at how old his subjects were?
Now, once again, there must be 20 because
they're 20.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right. So we know the classic formula for maximum heart rate, predicting it, is 220 minus your age. 220 minus 20 is 200. Divided by 10, that's 20. And so most of the people stopped exercising when their heart rate was around 200. Yep. And their perception was exhaustion. So that was a 20. Yep. And then it went on down. So the 6 to 20, and 6 being roughly 60 beats per minute for resting heart rate. It's funny how it's all related to heart rate. And so the 6 to 20 is sort of an awkward set of numbers. Yeah. And so at some point, I actually don't remember when it got changed to using a 10-point scale. But then someone said, oh, let's just go to a 10-point scale. Everyone works on this, yeah,
1 to 10, how do you feel, right? It's a very common. Right. Nobody comes up to you and says, okay, 6 through 20, how do you feel?
Yep, that's right. But what's interesting is, and this is the key, is perception of exercise is a valid way to gauge your intensity.
Yes.
Now, whether or not you tell someone correctly your perception of exercise intensity, that's different. But your perception, you can perceive your intensity quite well.
Yep, agreed.
All right. So sorry, that was just.
So that's perception, right? And perception matches the physiologic zones pretty well, which is the interesting thing about that study. Mm-hmm. Right. But once again, the study was done on very young people. Who knows on 50-year-olds?
Yeah, that's right.
So let's talk about these. The next kind of way we look at this is physiologic zones. So there's a bunch of different metrics that we can look at. Now, for the average person, just, average triathlete, they have one thing that they almost always will have, and that's heart rate. Pretty much every triathlete I know, they've got heart rate. If it's, maybe it's on the back of their watch optically, maybe it's a chest strap, one way or another, they can basically get their heart rate. And we can look at zones just purely off of heart rate and percentage of their maximum. Now, the tricky thing is finding out what your maximum is. Mm-hmm. So, John, how do you know what your maximum heart rate is?
Because I've done graded exercise tests.
Yes. You and I have done lots of graded exercise tests, right? So for people that don't know, a graded exercise test is, basically doing exercise and making it harder and harder and harder and harder over time. We've done some that have been like 12 minutes. We did some lactate testing that was quite a bit longer. That's one way to do it. How could somebody just, kind of anecdotally find their maximum heart rate?
Well, I think if you're wearing your heart rate monitor during all your exercise sessions, yep, as well as during your races, you can take a look back on your data and you can start to get a sense for how your heart rate responds. And, look at a 5K. and see how high your heart rate gets. That will not be your maximum heart rate.
But it'd be pretty close.
That's right. That's right. And so the shorter the event, for the most part, the closer you get. But you're right. The graded exercise test, a valid test, is anywhere from about 10 minutes as a minimum and really about 20 minutes maximum. And you're grading the intensity during that period of time, measuring heart rate. Maybe, if you're in the lab, like what we have access to, measuring VO2 and measuring your RPE. And when you stop, you look at what the heart rate was, and that's your heart rate max.
There's a few ways you can do it also. You could just get on a track if you're running and just every lap, try and go faster, or even every 200, try and pick up the pace. That's hard to do. I love the idea of a race. So I get my max heart rates from Zwift racing. And it blows my mind. That's the only way now I can get a maximum heart rate is to actually be in a race, a cycling race, and racing against other people. This summer when I was racing, I was out of town and had my trainer with me and didn't have a fan. And I got my heart rate to 181.
Mm-hmm.
And I forever thought my maximum heart rate was 176 because I hadn't seen 181. And lo and behold, when my temperature got elevated and I was trying to kill it, I hit 181 and it wasn't just a spike. It literally went 179, 180, 181. So I know it was pretty accurate. And so I was like, oh man, my max heart rate is higher than I thought it was. But now I know, it's, maybe over a year or two, it can go down a beat.
Mm-hmm.
But I pretty much know that that's where it is. And then the other one I do is there's a few Zwift races that I do that are 12 minutes long. They're crit races. And I can get pretty close to that, high 170s, almost 180 when I'm doing those 12-minute races. I find that, if you go longer than that, it's hard to, especially if you're going longer than that, it's hard to truly maximize yourself. So one of the things is we have to be able to try and figure this out. And I think you made a good point. You don't always have to quite get there because you can kind of make an estimate too. So you talked about a 5K. Maybe if you, for example, were to get to 175, you probably could add a few beats to that, relatively safely and say, oh yeah, that's where I'm at for my max heart rate.
Well, and then that leads us to, prediction of max heart rate.
Yeah.
And you can do that via just the equations, simple 220 minus your age, which is not a great equation. And I don't think anyone's really using that anymore, but it's an easy one just to remember, 220 minus your age. And it gives a guesstimate, probably plus or minus 15 beats wrong. So it can be, 30 beats on, one side or the other. So it's really not a great way. You can also do, and a lot of fitness gyms will do this, where they will have you do maybe 3 submaximal levels of exercise and then try to extrapolate that out. But they're still using an age prediction to still figure out what your heart rate max is, even in that stage.
And I'm a good example of it not being right? So if I hit 181 and I'm 48, I shouldn't be there. I should be at 172.
I really like wearing the heart rate monitor and going back and looking at data, because we're all built a little bit differently. Some people have hearts that just beat, slower, and some have smaller hearts and beat faster, because it's not actually the heart rate that's important.
No.
What you really want, the reason why we measure heart rate is it's a predictor of rate of oxygen consumption.
Yeah.
That's all it is. It's a proxy. It's a predictor. If I had to measure anything, or if I was able to measure anything, it'd be VO2 during exercise.
But that's not so easy.
That's right. It's a little bit
strap on your back and go. So when we're looking at the intensity zones, if we have the metric of heart rate, we can use it as a rough predictor of what intensity zones we're going to be in.
But and as you said, if you start getting dehydrated, if there's other things going on, that heart rate may change. That doesn't necessarily mean your rate of oxygen consumption has changed. So
So if everything else is equal, it's like I said, it's a surrogate. It's a decent number. And if we look at our lowest zone here on this zone 1, so like a recovery aerobic zone, we're looking at it maxing out. So anything below 75% of your maximum heart rate. And that's pretty close to where most people end up. And then we move up to zone 2, the top of the aerobic zone gets to 85% of maximum heart rate. Now, I wanted to talk briefly about that. And we've talked about this before, about that number and that spot, because that really kind of marks a physiologic mark of where we're starting to build lactate faster. So lactate threshold 1 and ventilatory threshold 1 are very close to that delineation between 2 and 3. And in this picture, basically, we have the greens being aerobics, the 3 kind of being a crossover point, and the 4 being more anaerobic, even though we can still, there's a big portion of aerobic exercise still happening here. And the interesting thing is the heart rate correlates pretty well with percentage of VO2 max, because you'd mentioned that it's a good marker for, it correlates well with VO2 max, and it correlates a little bit with lactate. And we'll talk about lactate actually on the next slide. But I think it's important, with what we talk about in endurance-based sport and in long distance sport. And I will also contend that sprint triathlon, we've talked about this before, is very aerobic.
Yeah.
Right.
Has to be.
It has to be. If you really think about it, and we've talked about this before as well, if I was to tell you we're going to run a half marathon, is that aerobic or anaerobic? Everyone's, that's definitely aerobic. It's about the same time for most people to do a sprint triathlon as do a half marathon, right? So we're definitely talking aerobic. And so training in those aerobic zones, in the majority of the training, especially for older athletes, is in that spot. Now we'll talk about there are reasons to train in the other zones. And knowing where those zones are is ultimately quite important.
Now, one more part on the heart rate max and these zones is your heart rate max is different based upon what we would say mode of exercise you're doing.
Yep.
So if we did a test in the water doing swimming,
yep,
you're gonna have a different heart rate max than biking and different heart rate max than running. And so that is important to keep in mind. And again, this is why I really put a lot of value in measuring heart rate during all your exercise sessions and going back and looking at data, because your heart rate will respond differently for any RPE, and that actually leads to just a little bit different physiological response as well.
So it's interesting, John. So I agree with you, but I was also reading an article, I'm sure I could find it, that was talking about really high level swimmers, Olympic level, can actually get similar max heart rates to their counterparts in running. But most of us are mere mortals.
Yeah.
We just can't work hard enough in the water to do that. So they're talking about especially 400 meter swimmers can get to their maximum heart rate. And like I said, and it would be very, very similar to a runner. But we run into the problem as mere mortal swimmers is our arms just get too dang tired.
Yeah, no, it is. There's a lot of technique involved with this, and I've done a lot of research on running in the water.
Yep.
And we've done a lot of maximum tests running in the water, and we saw the same thing: is that in general you have a lower max heart rate when running in the water. But if you're really experienced at running in the water, you could actually achieve the same heart rate in the water than on land. But it took a lot of experience to get to that point. So very, very similar to what you're looking at with the swimming.
Yeah, because I know when I take my heart rate swimming, oh man, to get out of zone 2 is hard. My arms are falling off to get out of zone 2 swimming.
Well, and this is why I think it's important to adjust zones based upon sport. I don't think it's the same zone. And so with swimming, there is more and more technology coming out that allows you to even get real-time heart rate. And we've never had that before. And so there's even a little bit of adjustment in terms of what should your heart rate be, but it most likely should not be what you see during running.
Yeah, or cycling. But I feel like cycling and running are very close.
Yeah.
Especially if you're fit in both of them, right? Like if you would consider yourself a good runner and a good cyclist, or an average runner, average cyclist, there would be, absolutely a difference if you're an elite runner and a good cyclist. Yeah. Let's talk about lactate.
Okay.
So, I spelled that wrong, but that's okay. So we're talking about lactate thresholds. Let's just get rid of that. Let's talk about lactate. So when we're talking about lactate, and John, you've talked about lactate before on the podcast, and you have a really good way to explain it. But what we're talking about when we're talking about lactate is the blood level of lactate, right? And it's measured in millimoles per liter. Now, it's not easy to do lactate testing. I got to be honest with you. How many test strips did we go through, John?
Yeah, your fingers get sore.
And your fingers get sore, after the 30th time you prick. And John, we did his on his ear one time.
Yep.
It's not an easy measure to get. The monitors are expensive. You can get one for about $500. The strips are about $2 a strip, and you need about 20 of them to do a test like this. And so it's not a cheap thing to do, but it's a pretty good measure for determining ultimately what your fuel source you're burning is at any given time, and helping us set up these zones and these thresholds. So this now is a 3-zone model. So this would be looking at something more like the polarized training model, where we would do a lot of work potentially in zone 1, the 80% in zone 1, maybe 20% in zone 3. But what we're really looking at is these two kind of thresholds. So LT1 and LT2. John, you want to talk us through what those are?
Can you hit your slide to do 100%? I think we're, there. Okay, that's. Is
that better?
Yeah, we're seeing the bottom.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Quarter of it right now.
Can you see it now?
Is it my screen?
Mine's in full screen.
Okay, maybe it's my screen then. All right, because I'm not in full screen. All right, so great explanation of lactate. And lactate is what we call a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism of glucose. So the chemical reactions of glucose, if we're going to use that to generate ATP, which is then used to make the muscles contract, that process yields lactate when oxygen is not available. And then what happens is, and funny is, the anaerobic system is always happening. It's happening right now. And if we do a finger prick right now and measure how much lactate is in the blood, there will be lactate in the blood. This test that you're showing here is a graded exercise test, and the blood is being drawn out probably every minute or every 2 minutes or maybe every 3 minutes, or through a finger prick or a prick in the earlobe. And then you put it on a special test strip, as you talked about. You measure lactate, and that's the amount of lactate in the blood.
And for people, it's kind of like a diabetes test strip. So
yeah, that's right.
If you've seen that, it's very, very similar.
Yeah. And so this is a very characteristic curve of what we would expect to see during a graded exercise test, where the intensity gets harder and harder and harder. And so you got power on the x-axis. So that's cycling 100, 125, 150. Those are easy. 175, 200 gets harder, and so forth, keeps going. And we see this nonlinear response of how much lactate is in the blood as we go along. Well, what we're measuring is actually a function of how much lactate is being produced by the muscle, which is a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism, and then how much is also being used. So that aerobically, lactate can be pulled back into a muscle, either the same muscle or a different muscle, and used as a fuel in the aerobic pathway to generate ATP, which again, ATP is then used for muscle contraction. So what we're seeing in the blood is a difference between how much is being produced and how much is being used. So in that light exercise in the green zone, that is where the amount of lactate that's being produced is also matched by how much is being used. Then we get into zone 2, we start to exceed how the production is starting to get greater than the amount that is able to be removed. And then in the red zone, zone 3, that is definitely an area where the amount of lactate being produced is exceeding the amount that can be used or even buffered at that point. And so the concept is that zone 3, the anaerobic system is working a lot. So you're taking glucose, stored chemical energy, converting it to ATP, which is going to allow you to contract your muscle without oxygen. So you could in essence hold your breath, and you can do that. You don't need oxygen to do that, but you can only last so long with that, because eventually you can't keep exercising. And so that's where lactate is often used as a sign of, well, you're probably getting pretty close to the end of your test, or you're in a real high intensity because you're using both aerobic and anaerobic systems at a really high level.
Yeah,
sorry, that was a long answer.
No, that was good. And so to break that down for in general, for just training purposes, the LT1 and below, you should be able to go forever.
Yep.
Like, or as long until you get bored.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's truly, that is really the aerobic, almost all aerobic.
Yep.
Right. Then your LT2 is really nicely correlated actually with, you can go for about an hour at that point. It's pretty close to where your FTP is, which we'll talk about, your functional threshold power, or your 1 hour run power or time, maybe a 10K race, right around that number. Now, I think the most fascinating thing with this, and John, maybe you think so too, I hope you do, is that we can train this.
Yeah.
And we can change this curve. We're always talking about, these days bending the curve. Mm-hmm. We can bend this curve. And what aerobic training in general, long course triathlon especially, what we would like to do is we'd like that zone 1 to get bigger. Mm-hmm. Right? And this line to stay low longer. So the longer it stays low, so for example, if I'm still in zone 1 and I'm at 200 watts,
that's good.
That is good stuff. So think about that. If you could go 200 watts forever, yep, and you're basically utilizing very little glucose for your metabolism, basically you're pretty much utilizing all lipids and fat at that point. Yep. That in essence is what you want for long course racing. Mm-hmm. And to make that happen, we actually do need to train the majority of the time below lactic threshold 1 or LT1. And the longer and the more you train down here, the more this curve is going to continue to bend downwards and allow you to actually do that. Now, the difference between a triathlete, for example, and a road cyclist is very important here. Because a lot of the triathletes that I see in training programs that I've seen are built by cycling coaches, not necessarily triathlon coaches, and they are not thinking about you're going to be racing for 10 hours. They're thinking, oh, you're going to be racing for 3 or 4 hours, an age group level cyclist, and you're going to have to sprint up every hill as hard as you can, or you're going to get dropped, and you're definitely going to have to sprint at the finish. Because what ends up happening when you bend this down, right, then the peak on the zone 3 doesn't get as high either. You actually lose some of this peaking here. And then that is the side where you can't sprint anymore. Right? When you change the curve, you change your ability to sprint. And the truth of the matter is, you cannot have it both ways. Mm-hmm. Right? You can be an amazing aerobic athlete or an amazing sprinter. You cannot be both. And you could be good at both, but you cannot be amazing or great at both.
You are spot on. Now, when Eliud Kipchoge
Yep.
is running, when he's doing a sprint, he's well,
Still fast. His
his
2 hour time is faster than my 100.
That's right. All right. You know what I'm trying to say.
But when he did the breaking 2, I guarantee you most of the time was just slightly below his LT2.
That's right. And that is well beyond my sprint capability, I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
If we look at an elite cyclist who is, let's say, more of an elite time trialist,
yeah,
right, who doesn't have to have a big sprint, they're also going to have a curve that looks like Kipchoge, right?
Mm-hmm.
They might be able to hold, like Bradley Wiggins, when he set the 1 hour record, was 450 watts for an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But he was at his LT2 at 450 watts.
That's amazing.
Right. And, you know, as a triathlete, if I could be at my LT2 at 450 watts, life would be good.
That's right.
Life would be really good. But once again, these curves are trainable. And once again, as a long distance triathlete, I am more concerned about bending the curve down and getting my LT1 to move to the right than I am about getting my LT2 higher or my zone 3, basically the curve to go steeper.
Yeah. Yeah. I forget who we talked to, but I really liked the way he had explained it is you can only push LT1 up.
Yeah.
Meaning you needed to do the majority of your training below that intensity to be able to raise it upwards. And I thought that was a good way of thinking about it.
Well, and the truth of the matter is you can only raise LT2 and FTP, well, not only, most successfully by raising it up too. No. So there are reasons you'd want to increase LT2. For example, you're doing sprint triathlons, a lot of it is right near LT2 or just below it. And so training just below that, you can actually increase your LT2 as far as wattage as well, but basically from below it.
Yeah. Yeah. But this is where, and I know you're going in this direction, this is where the polarized training or the high intensity training does come back into play. Yeah. Because there is some advantage to getting above those, but getting well above them, generating that lactate, and then the system learns how to reprocess lactate as a fuel.
Yeah. So then you can utilize lactate. So in zone 1, you don't have to utilize lactate.
No, that's right.
But a lot of our racing, so for example, in a half Ironman, I'm going to be at about 90% of LT2. Okay. So I'm going to be aerobic, but there will be some anaerobic component, and I need to exactly efficiently shuttle and utilize the lactate I'm producing. Right. And so you're right. In the polarized model, I'm going to spend some time, and you don't need much, some time just below LT2.
Yeah.
And build up time just below LT2, so my body learns, once again, how you're exactly right, how to utilize lactate. And that is an important part of it. You can't do just all zone 1. Well, you can, but when you go to race and you're trying to go a higher percentage of your threshold, then ultimately you're going to you potentially would struggle. Yeah.
So there's a question on Facebook from Bob. He says LT1 equals ventilatory threshold, LT2 anaerobic threshold, ?
How about this picture?
Oh, I like it. You're ready.
I'm ready for the question, Bob. So the answer is very close. Very close, but not exact, but close enough that we could say yes. At least I would say that. Now, if I get you into a lab, it might not be exact, but remember, when we're doing this stuff, it's not perfect even in a lab, but it's actually very close. So let's talk about the ventilatory thresholds and what those are. So you can actually see when we look at the red dots here, the curve actually looks very similar to lactate, but what we're measuring here is VE, so ventilatory exchange rate in liters per minute. So how much?
This is how much air is being expired.
Yeah, air is being expired, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is the one I like to think about. more than lactate, to be honest with you, because this one makes sense to people. When
Mhm.
you get to VT1, you can actually see this very slowly, the amount of air going out is doesn't really raise that much, but then it kicks up. So about to here is where you could talk, right? When you get to VT1, a good surrogate for VT1 is you can't talk. You lose the ability to actually have a conversation, right? So that's a good surrogate for VT1. And we'll see, like when we look at you pull lots and lots of data, it is really close to LT1. Is that what you?
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's spot on. And ventilatory threshold is a lot like lactate threshold, but they're not exactly the same concept. See, one of the things I didn't mention about lactate is not only can lactate get pulled in and used as a fuel, if it's not pulled in and used as a fuel, it's buffered. And when you buffer lactic acid, you actually get CO2 as a byproduct. So what happens to the CO2? You expire it. You get rid of it. You blow it out. And so when we look at ventilatory threshold, we're actually looking at what's happening with the combination of VO2 and VCO2, because that would be the majority of air being expired. And so during a graded exercise test, VO2 will increase linearly. So if you start to see, if we know now that lactate increases non-linearly, that means we're going to have more VCO2 being expired as well when we start reaching that lactate threshold. And so your volume of expired air starts to go up too. So they're linked physiologically, but they're not necessarily the same point. But conceptually, they mean the same thing in that that point is where you're starting to see a greater, the anaerobic system is starting to contribute at a faster rate to moving you forward or contracting the muscle.
Yeah, love it. And, I like the VT1 and utilizing it as a training metric. I don't have anything else.
Yeah.
Because you can tell somebody, if you're going to be training aerobically and pushing yourself in that direction, be the more aerobic engine, you should be able to have a little bit of a conversation. You don't even be having the thoughtful conversation, but you should be able to talk. One of the things I do when I train, I listen to music sometimes when I train, and I sing along with the music.
Oh, that's good.
Right? If I can sing along with it, I know, and I can't maybe sing every line.
Yeah.
Right. But if I can sing a few lines as I'm going, okay, I know that I'm below my VT1.
That's good.
It's one of the things that I use.
And I like that phrase aerobic threshold. That was not taught for a long period of time.
Yeah.
But it does conceptualize the idea that if you're below that point, you are really using predominantly the aerobic pathway to contract the muscle. But you get above that, now you're starting to use anaerobic processes at a faster rate.
Yeah. And when we talk about VT2 and LT2, I think it's important to know that distinction is basically, once you get above that, your time is limited. Right? Most people can hang in there in between these two. So we see MLSS, maximum lactate steady state, right? We can buffer enough of the lactate in here, and we can hang in here. But once you get above it, your time is absolutely limited. And so, for example, if you're doing a race and you are, I don't know, there's a big hill that comes up and you're like, okay, man, I'm going to crush it. I'm going to crush it up this hill. You can only crush it so much, right? And because eventually you're not going to be able to buffer the lactate or utilize the lactate or clear the lactate. And your time there is very limited. And that time, it's important to understand, and I think you alluded to it, utilizes a lot of energy, right? And so we talk about in triathlon burning matches, right? So time above VT2 or even just below VT2 or even LT2 is burning matches, right?
And you only have so many matches in your matchbox. Now you can try to build more matches in there.
Yeah, but the problem is that exactly that. This is, would you rather have a few more matches where you could go anaerobic, or would you rather have a bigger base to start with? And that's the whole part of the polarized training model. And as we started talking about this, the older athletes training model, where it's bang for your buck, right? Mm-hmm. And you know, there's the term in cycling or in triathlon. It's I'm sure you heard of it, is like bike for show, run for dough, mm-hmm. right? I look at it a little bit different. I'm like, sprint for show, run long for dough.
Yeah.
Right. Because that 20-second, 30-second sprint up the hill, if you got nothing left at the end, and I guess this is the old tortoise and the hare proverb, right? And we really, you need to be thinking like that. And, you know, we talked about this when we did the Training Peaks talk, and we'll talk more about this in the future, is looking at like the variability index. Mm-hmm. And, you know, how many times you actually went to the well, and, you know, and weren't in this kind of the steady, in this lactic steady state, and you jumped above it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's it's important to recognize. And once again, you can't have it both ways.
No, that's right. But I think this goes back to when we talked about course recon. Yep. Is that it is important to know what kind of course you're training for, because if you do have a course that's purely flat, well, not purely flat, but really flat, you know, Florida would be one.
Yep.
I'm hearing
Arizona, I'd consider relatively flat.
Yeah, but Arizona's got some good climbing, but it's not it's not steep climbing, out of the saddle type of climbing.
Right. Yeah.
And I think Sacramento is going to be a pretty fast course.
Dead flat.
Meaning it's not going to have a lot of undulating terrain. But if you do a course like down at, you know, Lake Mead, Silverman, you know, the St. George. I mean, now you've got to deal with these potentially high intensity situations. These, you know, climbing up a hill, then you go downhill. That's where you do need to do some course recon to know, you know, there's going to be times where you may need to get up into a higher zone, and you got to train for that.
Oh, I completely disagree. Just because I want to.
Oh, okay.
I could just get different gearing on my bike and keep the exact same power.
No, that's right. No, and that's your power plan. But at the same time, the tendency is when you're going uphill to get out of your saddle.
Yeah. I was being devil's advocate.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. And you and I both enjoy in a race, changing position and standing up, mm-hmm. and putting out a little bit more wattage. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, and then on the downhill, just getting a nice aero tuck position and really not pedaling. Yeah. So for sure. All right, let's move on to the next slide, because the next slide is basically, this is built out of, you know, Andy Coggan. He, you know, put this into the, the training with a power meter book from 1992, 1993. Yep. And this is an interesting one, because this is a 7-zone model. And this is a really common model for cyclists to use. And you'll see this in Training Peaks, and you see this in different literature. So this is where it adds some problem to me, because, you know, historically we went with 5 zones or even 3 zones. Now we get to 7 zones. There are some now that have 9 zones. Mm-hmm. I got to be honest with you, for most athletes, like that are age groupers, you don't need so many zones.
No.
Right. No. I think you need to know kind of where that VT1, LT1 is, VT2, LT2 is. And you can set your training pretty well with just those things. And really, this is kind of saying the same thing, right? So if we're getting to the blue here, we get to the end of the blue, this would be your VT1, LT1. When we're talking about lactate threshold, the top of lactate threshold would be or in the middle of lactate threshold actually would be the LT2, VT2. And then above this, honestly, above this for most of us is not really, especially for a long distance triathlete, is not too relevant. Mm-hmm. Although, I mean, there are reasons to train at VO2 max, because honestly, having a bigger VO2 max does you know, give you a bigger pool of resources to kind of get to. But for the older triathlete in particular, I find that once again, it can be a little bit dangerous up in that area, because that's where we tend to get hurt.
Yeah, you're spot on. VO2 max by itself is not a great predictor of performance,
Right.
but in general, a higher VO2 max is probably better than a lower one. So back when I worked in cardiac rehab, I think there was one person I remember testing who may have had a VO2 max of about 10 mLs per kg per minute. All right, resting is 3.5. Okay, an athlete will have anywhere, age grouper anywhere between 30 to 60. Maybe the really top athletes are up around 70, and then a really elite athlete would be 80. We're talking 10 mLs per kg per minute. That person did not have a lot of options for being able to exercise or even move, and her daily life was not good at all. And so that you're right, you do want to improve your VO2 max. That does give you some more options. And so I think that is important, but by itself, it's not a great predictor.
Yeah. And I like to do some VO2 max work. I do, especially in the off season.
Mm-hmm.
I like to do it to, maybe I can bump my VO2 up a couple points. And once it gives me, it gives like a little bit more top end where my top end would be, understanding that I'm not going to ever race, in the, at my VO2 max. But I think it's a decent thing to look at, especially if you test yourself and you know where your VO2 max is, and you see that there is potentially some ability to gain there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if you have a relatively low VO2 max, when we look at norm tables, there is the possibility of actually doing some work there.
Yep.
The interesting thing is VO2 max is kind of different than than we talked about the LT2, LT1 and pushing them up. VO2 max needs to be trained in that zone.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a lot of good literature on this. Is like, if you don't get to that, at least, and actually the interesting thing is it depends on the person too. The 106 to 120, that's a big range, by the way, of threshold power.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see in the literature is some people can increase their VO2 max quite easily and get there quite easily, get to that 106 number. Some people need to get all the way to the 120, and there's different testing protocols to determine who you are. But, and why this is interesting is some people, for example, in like 3 minutes, can't get that 106% of their threshold heart rate. They just can't get there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's hard to get there. Right. If my threshold heart rate, I think, is like 160. So then I got to get to like 160, I don't know, 168
Mm-hmm.
to get to the VO2. 3 minutes of hard running, I can't get there.
Oh, that's hard.
It's really hard. So I mean, there's a lot of variability there, and you got to play around with it. The one thing I will add, though, is this neuromuscular power one.
Mm-hmm.
And that's these really, really short sprints. And they're super short, like 5 to 15 seconds. I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing to be doing, because if you can do it safely, and I prefer to do it on a bike if I'm gonna do this, and maybe a little bit running, because I'm not really working on my energy systems here, right? I'm really working on more like, I wouldn't even call it neuromuscular power coordination.
Yeah.
Like, I actually believe that doing a few short sprints every now and then is a really good thing to keep your body moving fast. And same on the bike, just hammering out for 15 seconds. And it's more for muscular coordination than it is truly anything else, I think.
No, I love it. You're spot on. And that's the neural part of this neuromuscular power part, is that coordination. You got to learn how to fire, one muscle and relax another muscle so that you're not working against yourself. And so that coordination pattern of what we would call agonist and antagonist groups is really important. Those that causing the movement, and those that would be resisting it. So that is important. Now, I always like to go back and think, anytime we throw this word power in there, power is just telling us how fast we're transforming energy from one state to another. And in this case, we're talking about taking chemical energy or carbohydrates or fats, whatever, and transforming it over to, in essence, force to cause the muscle to contract. So mechanical energy. And so neuromuscular power is a combination of all the energy pathways and the coordination.
Yeah, and when you're doing the neuromuscular power stuff, if you do want to do it, have long rest intervals.
Mm-hmm.
Like do your 10 seconds, have 2 minutes, 3 minutes break in between, because you're utilizing the the creatine phosphate system, and it takes time to basically rebuild into your system. But that wasn't kind of the purpose of this talk. This was more to talk about the different levels, the different zones. So we have one more slide I want to add, and I found this chart today, and I kind of liked it because it was kind of a chart that put everything together in one. And there's a lot going on here.
Just a little bit.
But if you really look at it, it basically talks about almost everything we talked about today.
Yep.
In one chart. Okay. We can even start talking about, like, can you talk? Right? What's your RPE? How do you describe it? What's your lactate levels? What type of workouts would be appropriate? What areas it benefits? How many calories you burn per minute? Percentage of threshold? All of these pieces are together. And I can't tell you, I love this chart.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna kind of, maybe I'll print this one out and put it on my fridge, right?
Nice. Yeah.
And I just think and I just honestly, I just came across it today, and I wish I knew who actually coined it. I took it off another website, but it wasn't that, they didn't make it. But I really liked it, and it's nice to see it all kind of together, and it definitely, to me, helps make sense when they're when it's all together. And and this is a 5-zone model, but zone 5 is kind of broken down into 3 different areas. So I guess this is more like a 7-zone model.
No, that's great. Now so the critic in me, I would say I would not use the phrase non-aerobic.
I agree.
You're always going to be using the aerobic pathway, unless you're holding your breath or doing things underwater. But that zone 5 is where you start to see lots more anaerobic conversion of energy, and as well as an increase in aerobic conversion of energy. So,
and I don't necessarily like the term, like, the high threshold, low threshold.
Yeah.
Because it kind of gets confusing, because really on this model, LT1 or VT1 is it's between zone 2 and zone 3. Right? And their T1 would be LT2.
Yep.
So it is a little bit confusing compared to what we just talked about, but if you kind of keep those things in mind, ultimately that's what we're talking about here.
No, that's great. Post a link in the Facebook thread.
Yeah.
For this. That would be great for people to have that, because it is good information. I mean, it's all about trying to have a plan on how to get better. And and you and I both have followed the research in this area, and it is pretty strong that you need to do a lot of consistent training, and the majority of your training needs to be in those lower zone regions.
Yeah, and I'm going to throw out there that I think sometimes for us, not us, and the people that we know, Strava is a problem, right? Because nobody wants to put, I did 4 hours at 130 watts.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, that's not like something you beat your chest over.
Yeah.
But for some people, that would be the best thing they could possibly be doing. Right? And so, I encourage people to, when you post on Strava, put stuff like easy aerobic day, zone 1, accomplished 100%. Right? So so when I think a lot of times we look at Strava, other people are judging us. Right? And and like, for example, like I know some pro triathletes, they don't post their long, slow stuff. They only post their beast stuff, when they're totally killing it and they're doing their intervals, and like, 4 times 8 at 120% of FTP, and they post that. Right? But you don't see the other 15 hours they did in zone 1.
Well, okay, so now and I 100% agree with you that Strava can be a problem, but I'm going to even give a challenge out that don't explain away your easy workouts.
Nope, don't
Just
explain away.
post them. Don't make an excuse for them and say, "Oh, this was a recovery run or this was that." Just post it because
Or
it's
make
your.
yourself, yeah, I'm saying, but still make yourself feel good, like you accomplished something,
That's
accomplished
right.
100%.
Totally. No,
You
that
accomplished it.
doing that training is just as important as doing those killer workouts, and
I say more important.
it should not be looked at as, oh, maybe I should, maybe I need to be trained. Yeah. Now, do I look at people and say, oh man, I got to train a little bit harder? Oh, that's the tendency, but that's the danger of Strava or whatever else we're following on that. So.
So what I love to look at on Strava is when people do a 5-hour ride, and I love to look at, well, what was their average heart rate?
Yeah.
Right? Because if I look at it, and their average heart rate for a 5-hour ride was 160 beats a minute. I'm like, oh my gosh, that person killed themselves for nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
They actually probably did themselves harm rather than good. And but then I see somebody like, I'm going to give you big credit here, John. Like some of your big rides, I look at it and you're like 112 beats a minute. Right? But that's exactly what you should be doing.
Yeah.
You are doing the zone 1 work that it truly takes to develop the aerobic side. And I give big kudos to you for doing that and sticking to it, because I know you could easily go harder, right?
Yeah, but then I'd pay the price and I wouldn't be able to train the next day.
Exactly. And because here's the thing, it's the long game. And well, and I'll give you one other thing that I think is also important to understand, that if you do not want to play the long game in triathlon, right? If your goal in triathlon is to do, I'm going to do 1 Ironman and I'm going to retire. That's my goal. You don't have to do this.
No, right.
There are shortcuts. You can actually do a lot of high intensity training, and you can actually make a lot of improvements relatively quickly, but you will be capped. Like you will never get to the point where you could be consistently good, and you'll never be great.
No, and we know plenty of people that have done that, and they do it for a year or 2 years, and then they're just wiped out. They're just done, and then we don't see them again. And that's really sad. Maybe they've achieved something, but at the same time, the way you and I look at it, it's great to be able to do this for a long period of time, and really, have the lifestyle. So
yeah, and I'm looking at this is the long game, right? This is I want to be doing this in my 70s or longer.
I was talking with my mother just before this call, 87 years old, and I told her, "Hey, Mom, I got to go do a podcast." And she said, "Oh, it's on what?" I said, "On training zones." And she goes, "Well, how hard should I be exercising?" And I said, 87-year-old mom, what you need to just do it every day. And she says, "Well, I break out in a sweat. I do 10 push-ups." I'm like, "That's fantastic." So
that's fantastic.
And that's what we want to, my goal is to eventually be the oldest person in a race. That's one of my goals.
Yeah, to be the oldest person in a race with 2,000 people, right?
That's right. That's right.
That's a great goal. And you know how you get there, and you do, it's doing this polarized training.
And sustainable.
Yeah. One day we'll do this where we'll actually get maybe a sports cardiologist on the line.
That would be great.
And we'll talk about, the benefits of the long, easy, and the damage, especially as we get older, in the really hard and going too hard too long. My dog's losing his mind.
Okay, give me a wrap up. Give me a bookend. What's the take-home message?
The take-home message, as far as I can see, is to, number one, recognize what the zones are. So, when people or coaches or people are talking about their zones, that you know what they're talking about. And number two is, when you figured out your zones and you figure out your training plan, stick to it.
Yep.
For the long game. Sorry about my dog.
No, I think that's my dog, isn't it? Is that your dog?
No, it's my dog.
Oh, I thought it was mine.
He's like, "Hey, it's time to have dinner. It's 7 o'clock.
Oh, well, hey, this is a great talk, and I 100% agree with you. And, you know, it is the long game, and that's why we do it. So
Yep, absolutely.
Good deal. Well,
have a good weekend.
Yeah, you too.
And we'll talk next week.
Okay, sounds good.
Bye-bye.
All right.